Both of us single dads from the Midwest, we can talk about it. Both of us single dads from the Midwest, we can talk about it. Both of us single dads from the Midwest, we can talk about it. Or we can get gully, y'all size up your body and put some white chalk around it.
Welcome to the Single Dads of the Midwest, episode 33. We're joined by the amazing Akash, who has experience working for the Federal Reserve and is also a lawyer himself. So we're going to talk about economics, actually one of my passions as well. So I'm really excited, and who knows where the conversation will go, but there's a lot of things to talk about in today's economy. So Akash, would you like to introduce yourself with anything that I might have missed?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Now, I think you caught all the important stuff. I'm a law professor at NYU School of Law and NYU Stern School of Business. I spent much of my professional career at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where I was an execution trader for the QE3 program. I was a sovereign bond portfolio manager for a European central bank. And then most recently during the pandemic, I helped run the commercial paper funding facility, effectively as its chief operating officer.
Amazing. So a lot of stuff to talk about. I guess we could talk about probably the most relevant topic in American economics, which is inflation. We see stuff both on the demand and supply side, like supply side being COVID, not enough, perhaps in certain industries, not enough, not the ability to produce as much goods. And then on the demand side, with stimulus checks and stuff, one could argue too much dollars or money chasing too few goods and services. I guess, what are your thoughts? Do you see this as temporary or something more permanent? I'm just curious, as an economist, what your take is on the current state of inflation.
It's definitely not temporary. I think we will see, by the standards of the last 20 years, high inflation for most of the coming decade, at least 5% annually.
What makes you have that opinion versus, I know some economists believe it's just a bump from like COVID levels being artificially low, but that this is also a shock, especially with the war in Ukraine. What would be your response to that?
So the simplest explanation of inflation for me is that it's simply too much money chasing too few goods. So you alluded to this before. You said that there's demand side and supply side issues that are creating inflation. Well, I can tell you two things that have added to the demand side of inflation, or particularly the too much money. One is the Trump tax cuts, which were, in my opinion, unnecessary at a time when the economy was already doing well. And then second, the Biden stimulus, which debatable whether or not that was the right policy move or not. Regardless, these two policies taken together have added a lot more money into the economy without a corresponding increase in GDP, which is the amount of goods and services produced. So as long as you have that imbalance, you're just going to have inflationary situations like those. That's the building blocks of inflation. Another way that you can look at this is the amount of government debt in relation to US GDP. So this is something that I don't think is as well understood among the general public, but basically debt is money. Money is debt. So the cash dollars that you have in your wallet, those are debts of the Federal Reserve. Whereas when the government spends money in a deficit, whether through tax cuts or stimulus checks, those are IOUs that the government is providing you in exchange for your goods and services. So all of this together adds up to a large amount of money floating around in the economy. And I don't know exactly what the right amount is, but just conceptually thinking, if there were only two people in the economy, me and you ran a hot dog stand, for example, there's like some amount of cash that it makes sense to exist between us to have the right amount of exchange between us. Actually, two people is not a perfect example. Let's say that there's 5 people.
Sure.
And each of us provides some service. You have hot dogs. I draft contracts. There's somebody who cleans houses. There's somebody who makes cars. And then there's somebody who does entertainment.
Okay.
These are the 5 people in the economy, and they all provide some good and service. There's some amount of cash dollars that we just need between the 5 of us to keep a reasonable accounting of who's owed what. So if somebody provides an entertainment service to the four of us, we owe them something in exchange. The way we keep track of that is money, so cash.
Mhm.
And we might be able to say, okay, well, given how frequently the five of us exchange goods and services, having about 200 floating cash dollars is enough. Because at no point will any one of us accumulate more than 200. At some point, we'll spend it for the services in exchange. What I think is going on right now is that total amount of dollars that we need, let's say that we needed 200 between the five of us, that amount right now is like 400. So we just don't need that many dollars to keep track of the exchanges between the five of us. That is basically, in my view, what's going on in the US economy right now.
Makes
So-
sense.
Inflation is not going to come down until the total amount of goods and services catches up to the float of cash dollars that's out there, or the cash dollars are destroyed somehow.
I know
One
there's-
way that they could be destroyed would be the government running surpluses.
Mhm.
And given the current political climate, I don't see consensus around balanced budgets or even budget surpluses.
I know other solutions that have been proposed are raising interest rates or even taxation as a way to take money. I mean, I guess that alludes to surplus, although you might not get a surplus, but more money coming to the government instead of chasing goods and services or like interest rates. If you had the magic wand, so to speak, what policies would you pursue to curb inflation?
Well, I think it's tough. I mean, I think the first thing that I would look at is the federal budget and figure out what exactly spending do we need to keep. Again, the really hard thing is that we just don't have political consensus on anything
Sure.
today, it feels like. But I can imagine that it's in part the US's strong economy and strong balance sheet that let us do all these foreign wars and all that stuff for the last 20 years. Now, that's a ton of money that we just basically set on fire. You could argue that we got some security benefits out of it, but it's not clear to me
Sure.
that it was worth however many trillions of dollars that we spent. So maybe there are savings to be had in certain parts of the budget where we just realize that, okay, actually, we don't need to be underwriting a whole lot of the planet's military budget anymore. We basically need to keep certain areas of the world safe for ourselves, and other areas of the world let other people take security responsibility. That is perhaps one place where you could find savings.
Very commonly alluded to, especially by the left. I'm curious what your experience was working at the Federal Reserve, because obviously, among other things, one of their big focuses is inflation. While also, it's sort of the whole balancing inflation, unemployment, other things like the stability of the dollar relative, especially to other currencies. What was your experience actually working on the ground at the Federal Reserve, tackling issues like this?
When I started my career, it was a terrific place to work. I would characterize it as super fun. The thing I enjoyed the most at the Fed was, at least early in my career, I had a great deal of flexibility in how I spent my time. So I had certain responsibilities relating chiefly to trading and market analysis. But assuming I could take care of those responsibilities, what I did with the rest of my time, as long as it was broadly related to economics or finance, it was okay. I was almost never told no by my management on any kind of project that I wanted to work on.
That's
Typically,
pretty
I
great.
would propose a project to them and they would be, great. Why don't you check in 6 weeks and tell us where it's at?
That's
I
great.
remember very early in my career on a Friday afternoon, there was an economist, I think his name was Steve Meyer, and he was seconded from the Board of Governors in DC to New York. And I was an econ undergrad, but there was still a whole lot of things in economics that passed over my head back then. I mean, I could answer the questions on an exam without understanding what I was writing on the exam. And I remember I cornered Steve near the trading desk, and I said, "Hey, Steve, can I ask you some questions?" And he said, "Sure." And then basically for the next 3 hours, I just talked to him about, and he's a PhD economist, a whole lot of things that I sort of half understood from undergrad, and he just walked me through everything. And for somebody who's curious about economics and likes to know this stuff, it's hard to put a price tag on 3 hours like that. And I had many, many encounters with people at the Fed with this kind of stuff. Going to somebody who's an expert on a topic and saying, "Hey, I don't understand this. Can we spend some time talking about it?" And people will take 2, 3 hours out of the day to do that.
That sounds like a great work environment.
It is a fantastic working environment. Downsides is that it is very hierarchical and very bureaucratic, as you would expect from a large government organization. That I felt much more keenly as I rose up in seniority. I didn't really feel it early in my career. Towards the end of my career, it was a main reason in me leaving.
Got it. And I know you mentioned working on quantitative easing, or specifically, I believe you said QE3. For those that don't know, do you want to maybe explain what that is from the Federal Reserve's perspective?
Well, the Fed doesn't actually use that term, but at least in formal communication, but that's generally what people in the market call it. Essentially, this is bond buying. And it has a fancy name today, but it's something that central banks have done for a long time. Maybe even in the 19th century, it was called, basically in the old days, we just called it open market operations. And QE3, in my mind, or the QE programs in general, they, particularly in the US, there was a targeting of the mortgage sector. So traditional open market operations would only be in high quality government bonds. And then the other main difference with respect to the QE3 program is it was much longer duration bonds than the Fed historically targeted, which were much more short-term bonds. But that's the way that the Fed would influence the money supply. One of the ways would be open market operations. So to me, it's just a fancy name for something that central banks have done for a while.
Sure. Let me look at the rest of the questions. But yeah, it seems like the Fed, I'm surprised that a government organization would offer, that much latitude. It's very rare that you would think of government organizations in terms of like flexibility with research or interests.
Well, the New York Fed, I would characterize as culturally, it's halfway between a university economics department and a Wall Street trading floor, which is a very strange mix when I think about them. So there's certainly aspects of Wall Street, and there's certainly aspects of a university. And when you blend them, you get this different cultural mix, which is the Fed.
Very interesting.
And I suppose there's a splash of traditional government in there too.
Makes sense. And I know that you moved on, or I don't know, moved on, but also in addition to getting a master's in public policy, got a law degree. What had you kind of go through that path, and then what sort of intersection did that lead between law and economics for you?
There was at that time no specific intersection between law and economics. I mean, to be quite frank with you, I went to law school because my parents insisted that I go.
Fair enough.
So that's a story that at least some people can recognize.
Definitely.
With respect to my law degree and working at the Fed, those two things basically had no overlap. I used to work at McKinsey. I was a management consultant, and that was my first job out of law school. And all of these career moves have just been me following my personal interest. So I went to McKinsey because I thought it would be more interesting than working in big law. And then I went to the Fed because I thought working in macroeconomics was more interesting than consulting. And all of those have been true. I don't regret any of those career decisions. And I actually don't regret getting the law degree either, because I find being a law professor to be also a lot of fun.
What's that experience like?
It's so I'm an adjunct law professor, which means that I don't have to deal with any of the research requirements or tenure. I mean, that to me sounds very unpleasant. I know for other people, it's something that they really like. For me, I'm more of the practitioner type person. So I just like teaching. I like interacting with students. I like having conversations like what you and I are having right now, and I get to do that as a professor.
That's great.
And to the extent that I want to participate or collaborate in somebody else's research, I can, but I don't have to do that.
Nice. All the benefits
There's
of
no
like the
there's no
teaching,
publish or perish if you're an adjunct professor.
all the benefits of teaching without, yeah, any of the harsh, or not harsh, but the responsibility of needing to research. That's like a thing too, because I've considered, I'm also getting my master's, or currently getting my master's in public policy. And one of the things that's always been in the back of my mind is getting a PhD in economics. But I just worry about being in that sort of paradigm, because I'm also very more hands-on and would prefer doing something um, where I'm in the field as opposed to doing research. And that's one of the qualms that I myself am wrestling with in terms of like whether I truly want to get a PhD.
Yeah, that is, to me, it's very much a question of a person's temperament.
Mhm.
Some people really are cut out to deep research in an academic discipline, and other people are not. I was fortunate that pretty early, actually when I was an undergrad, one of my political science professors, a guy named Ross Terrell, who was a mentor to me for a long time, he told me straight up that he didn't think that I was cut out to do a PhD. And he was the one that recommended to me that I consider getting a master's in public policy, specifically I went to the Harvard Kennedy School specifically at that program. And Ross was a visiting professor from Harvard. So I think he was very familiar with the program.
Sure.
And that advice, I don't know what my life or my career would have been like had I not had that conversation with Ross. Because doing that master's program was not on my radar at all.
What were the important skills that you learned through the master's program, or your biggest takeaways or experiences?
Biggest skills, it's hard to pinpoint at anything specific. I think I got a valuable foundation in statistics, and that wasn't a topic that I studied closely in undergrad. So I'm glad I did that, at least at the graduate level. I did some economics work, but I didn't think it was particularly intense compared to what I did in undergrad, nor did I what I ultimately did at the Fed. And I think I have a much more practical view of economics. So if economic theories that don't hold up when applied to the real world, I just don't have much use for them. So
I mean, that's a big thing that's been in vogue. I mean, people debating Keynes and then Reaganomics and all these things and models like the Laffer curve. But I'm with you. Like, it only makes sense if it can actually model real life and has practical applicability. What was I going to ask next? Is I know you said you transitioned then from working from the Fed to other work, and I believe you said you work with small businesses. And I'm curious, from the small business perspective, what are the issues that they're struggling with, especially in this economy?
Number one is inflation. So as you said, I've been having a lot of conversations with small businesses these days. Number one concern on everybody's mind is inflation. And it doesn't, at least for most of the small businesses that I've talked to, it doesn't seem like volumes are suffering. So people are still coming in and engaging with the business. Most of them, I haven't heard yet that they're like, I'm seeing a big drop off in customer foot traffic. There is one business that I talked to that actually is a smoke shop. And the manager said that she's seen almost a 50% decline in revenue, which I wouldn't expect. That's a business that I mean, people who are into smoking, you would think that it's very
Yeah,
countercyclical.
more of an inelastic good, relatively
Yeah.
speaking. Yeah.
But she's seen a huge decline in revenue. I was surprised. But other people like ice cream vendors, people who run print shops, people who repair car stereos, these are the kind of small businesses that I've talked to, and they all say business is great. In terms of customers coming in the door and demanding services or goods, that's all fine. The biggest problem that they're having is finding help. So a lot of people have described labor shortages.
Yep.
And it's not just that there aren't people, it's that people aren't willing to work at the wages that are being offered. So one small business owner told me that he's paying around $15, $16 an hour, and his competition is a packaging factory that is paying 22 an hour. And he said that there's just no way that my business can support that increase in labor costs. So if I went to 22, there's no way. He said I probably can't go to 18. So the business owner and his wife basically are just putting in the labor directly themselves. And
it seems to be a tricky situation with inflation because people want more wages given rising costs of living, but then that kind of compounds the problem because then small businesses have to pay more. So then it just like the cycle just kind of escalates.
Right. And so I have 2 points on this. The other thing I'll say is that small businesses have told me that they're very reluctant to raise prices on customers. So traditional economists will tell you that inflation does operate with a lag in the economy. So generally the first thing that gets squeezed is margins, because exactly you see this effect. There's an increase in input costs, whether they be raw materials or labor. But most businesses don't immediately want to pass the price increases on to customers. The one owner of the ice cream shop that I talked to, he told me that basically if he raises prices, customers will just go compromise on quality. It's not like they're going to stop buying ice cream, but he said that they'll stop coming to my shop. Instead, they'll go to the gas station or they'll go to the grocery store and they'll get their ice cream there. So in that sense, he doesn't feel like he has the room to raise prices to restore his margins. So he's either just reducing his input costs or keeping his input costs constant by making up for the labor himself, or he's just eating it in the loss of margin.
And what have been have you been able to find strategies that work with dealing with these issues for the businesses?
That's really difficult. I don't know exactly what can be done on the labor front. So one thing that the small business owners have told me is that it's very hard to even keep help. So we're talking about low skilled labor in the context of these small businesses. So they said that it's one guy who owns a food truck. He told me that for every 5 interviews that he schedules, 2 people will show up.
Wow.
So it's even if he's blocking off 3 hours to do interviews, like a lot of that is just dead time because people are not going to come to the interview. So there's clearly something is the supply, the market's not clearing on the labor side. So the supply and demand curves are pretty far apart in terms of pricing. And I don't know exactly what the reason is. Some people have said that, well, it's the Biden stimulus. And my reaction is I thought that stopped a long time ago. So I don't know exactly how people are making ends meet if they're not working. So this to me feels like a big puzzle right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough situation. And from what I understand, these are businesses operating in Austin, Texas, or in the Texas area. So I live in California, so we even see higher price hikes in terms of like, especially gas. I think gas is the most prevalent issue, but even the same thing. I mean, our minimum wage is already like $15, so um,
I haven't talked
it's
to
hard.
anybody in Austin that's paying less than $15 so far.
Mhm.
So whatever, I don't know what the minimum wage is in Texas, but the market, the market clearing price is clearly above the minimum wage.
Yeah. Well, and what has been your experience like personally in Texas? Because you were in New York before, from my understanding, and what's it like living in a completely different state, completely different city?
Oh, I'm from Texas, so this is
Oh, okay.
all familiar. I went to UT Austin for undergrad, so being back in Austin is, the city's changed a lot from when I was an undergrad. It's just grown tremendously.
Mhm.
And I think it is an example of a very hot local market. So during the pandemic, I know a lot of people from California and New York
Yeah.
moved to Austin. That did create inflationary pressure within the city, particularly on rental prices. We also saw quite a boom in a lot of technology stocks over the pandemic. So Austin is a tech heavy city.
Yeah.
So there were people that were, I have friends that work at Tesla and Shopify and companies like this. So there was an expectation of what I can afford with my stock options as of June 2021. And that reality we're starting to see change a lot. So basically all these tech stocks have either crashed or in the process of crashing.
Yep.
So that, I think it's changing a lot of people's, if you're talking, the Fed often talks about a wealth effect
Mhm.
that pushes up the stock market. I mean, that it boosts economic activity by pushing up the stock market. And I feel like, at least for a certain class of people, that wealth effect is real. So I think for the people who have, call it an 8, 9, 10 figure net worth, my guess is it doesn't matter. But the people who have a high 6 or low 7 figure net worth that is based on corporate stock options, and I think there's a lot of those people in Austin, that does matter in terms of the local economy, particularly in real estate.
And I know there's been more increased worries about asset bubble prices, especially since a lot of gains in the economy have come through these assets as opposed to productive services. Are you worried about potential crashes in the future regarding I mean, we've seen that recently, like you said, with stocks and crypto. Do you think that it's possible we'll get another major recession outside of a pandemic-based situation in the next 5 to 10 years?
Recession, I mean, it's an open question if we technically get a recession now. We had a
Mhm.
significant contraction in Q1, so I haven't seen, I don't know when the Q2 numbers come out, but we'll see if we're in a technical recession or not. And it's not the NBER definition, it's just the common market definition, which is 2 consecutive quarters of GDP contraction. I think with respect to the stock market, my view is that this is a temporary respite. I don't think this drawdown is done. Because as I said, the biggest thing that people are missing right now is where corporate profit margins can go.
Mhm.
And this has been talked about in economic and financial history literature before, but for some reason in finance, human memories are extremely short. And part of, so sometimes I'll see the people talking about Facebook and they say Facebook looks pretty well valued on a PE multiple basis. And that's because earnings have stayed constant, but the PE has come down a lot. So they're now the multiple looks good. The problem with PE ratios is that E is not constant.
Sure.
And as I mean, I've held this view even before I started talking to small businesses, but talking to small businesses, the number one place where their business is being modified is on the margins. So earnings are way down in the small business sector. I don't know exactly who measures the data. I imagine when we look at 2021 small business profitability in hindsight, or 2022, we're gonna see that it's a lot lower. And the same factors in play at the small business level, I think are going to be in play at the big business level. Increases in all input prices, especially labor, and customers that are going to be very resistant to price increases. I mean, what happens in an inflationary environment is people cut discretionary spend. Like, that's why you look at Netflix's stock. They reported like 1/4 of declining subscriptions, and then the stock fell to the floor. So earnings is going to be huge. And that's why I think like Facebook's PE multiple might stay constant, but the price is going to go down because their earnings are going to go down. Now, I'm using Facebook as an example. I don't actually know what is going to happen with Facebook's earnings, but I'm saying across the economy in general, even if stocks look well valued on PE multiples, you have to look at whether or not you think those earnings are stable. And I think for a lot of companies, they're not. And we saw that with Target.
Yeah.
So when Target reported their earnings, they were down significantly. And all of the other comparable retailers went down. Costco, Walmart, all those guys.
So given the state of all these problems, kind of going back to an original question, and I know it's tough because there's a lot of different factors at play. If you had like power of chair of Federal Reserve and president, and let's just say you had congressional approval for whatever reason or over ability, what changes would you do to try to like improve the economy if you could?
I would want to get to a state of what I consider historical normalcy. So on the monetary policy side, we probably don't need a Federal Reserve balance sheet at the size that it's at. So you probably don't need to sell, but continue tapering and letting bonds roll off the balance sheet. So that's fine. I also think that interest rates are too low. And if we look at interest rates over the course of US history and even human history, the current level that they're at, this 2-3% range, is not normal. So let interest rates normalize. And then finally, bring some sanity to the federal budget. So how much more IOUs does the federal government need to be creating? And probably at the situation that we're in, we want to do all of this stuff gradually. I have another view, which I haven't heard a lot of people at the Fed talk about. I mean, they might talk about it in private. They're certainly not going to say it in public. We have a huge backlog of bankruptcies that is going to come in the next 3 years. Because of very loose monetary policy in the past decade, I think there's a lot of corporate bankruptcies that could have happened after 2012 that were suppressed. So when you hear people talking about zombie companies, that's what I mean. Companies that are heavily indebted and they're just able to stay in business because they can keep rolling over their debt at equal or cheaper prices. But the fundamental business has serious problems, like operationally. And that is all going to come to a head with rising interest rates. So I think there is probably some, in the same way that human populations have some natural rate of birth and death, I think the death rate of corporations has been heavily suppressed at least since 2012, which was the last time I think we saw a spike in bankruptcy. So typically bankruptcies have a 2-3 year lag. After there's an economic crisis, 2008, 2009, it takes 2 or 3 years for the bankruptcies to actually play out. And then after 2012, we've had very, very low rates of bankruptcy. In fact, they've been declining every year. And even in the pandemic, I don't remember if the 2021 data is out, but 2020 bankruptcies were very low. So all of those pent up bankruptcies, that natural rate of death in corporations that's been suppressed, I think we're going to eat it all at once in 2 or 3 years. So I see all of this as just a shaking out. So the federal budget needs to be shaken out. The excessively loose monetary policy needs to be readjusted. And all these things in the economy, they just need to go back to normal. And this happens, like this has happened many times in human history. It's an adjustment period and it's painful. But the economy finds a new equilibrium.
So it seems like what's going on right now is basically the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, kind of like an early warning of potential things to come or things that need to be changed before a reckoning.
I think the reckoning is coming. I don't know if I would say necessarily canary in the coal mine, but there's just a lot of things that are overdue that are gonna come to a head. And the inflation was overdue. You can't print this many IOUs for such a long period of time and then think that inflation's not gonna happen. It just doesn't make any sense. Which is why when the Fed said that inflation is transitory, I just thought this is bizarre. I don't know what consolidated government balance sheets you're looking at, but that's not what I get when I see these numbers. But this has to happen.
Fair enough. Those were pretty much most of my questions in terms of general economics, but was there any particular, maybe recent interest or some other area that you'd like to discuss?
That covers it from my end. These are generally my thoughts on the economy based on the conversations and research I've been doing lately.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Akash, for coming on. I feel like I learned a lot. Hopefully, the Federal Reserve can. Well, it seems like they are going to theoretically raise interest rates, and hopefully, we can get the inflation under control.
I'll say one last thing. I don't think people have also grasped how aggressive a hiking cycle we might see. So I've seen projections from economic consulting firms for Fed funds at year end to be in the neighborhood of 3, maybe 3.5%, roughly in that range. And there's people in the investment community, particularly deal people that I know, that are making deal decisions based on that as a going forward Fed funds. But I think we could see a much, much more aggressive hiking cycle that goes way past 3%. We could see Fed funds at 6%.
That would be quite the jump.
I mean, it wouldn't probably happen in 1 year, but when we're looking at where did this cycle stop, I don't know what the terminal level of Fed funds is, but I can promise you it's not going to be 3.5%. I think it could be significantly higher than that. And I think you see that reflected in some market pricing, particularly on rate vol. But I wonder if it's baked into people's minds that, yeah, if I go out to try to get a mortgage, it's going to be an 8% on a 30-year. Like, that's possible. It's very possible that we will see that in our lifetimes. And if it's 8% on a mortgage for a 30-year, what does that mean for home prices? Because home prices are a function of what people can pay on a monthly basis. So when you have an 8% mortgage, what does that mean in terms of your paycheck? So,
well, I know it's been said by a few economists that real estate is definitely kind of starting to bubble again in terms of evaluations. I mean, I live in California, so it's always crazy, but it does seem exceptionally high in certain areas. So it's possible that that might crash as a result of a variety of factors.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's going to be a crash like 2008 because the credit situation is vastly better than it was in 2008.
Sure, I agree it won't be as bad, but I do think that it'll probably dip at some point.
It could dip, or we may just see really stagnant prices for a long time, because if the homes are overvalued and then people are thinking about, well, if I need to buy a new home, it might be the same or slightly lower price, but the mortgage is so much more expensive, my monthly payment goes way up. So you're just going to see less turnover in the housing market.
A big thing too, I don't know if it's true in other states, in California, is a lot of real estate is getting bought out by these big, like, kind of companies and land development, and they're just planning on holding on to it almost as an investment tool as opposed to a, actual use. And that could be worrisome because that means that they can kind of have the ability to hold on to these properties longer and not use them. I mean, it literally is kind of rent-seeking behavior in its like literal definition, which is one worry that it might not stabilize, is that you have so many companies buying the real estate that you don't have the normal consumer behavior because it's not done from like an average family buying a house. Rather, it's like a corporation.
So this all comes down to how can these guys finance their purchases? So if they're financing all these acquisitions in capital markets on floating rate debt, then what does that mean for their debt service coverage? Because how much can they hike rents if their cost of funds goes up? So this is like essentially it's almost like they're borrowing the capital markets and using that to purchase another bond-like instrument, which is a house that charges rent. It's like a bond.
Yeah.
So this is like interest rate arbitrage almost. So that all depends on whether or not you get caught out or not when rates move. So without looking at somebody's balance sheet and how they're funded, I can't tell you if these businesses are going to do well or do poorly. But if this is like really large scale stuff going on in California, I wouldn't be surprised if this blows up.
Well, time
Because everybody's whose business model is reliant on cheap funding sources from capital markets, like they have to be very, very careful right now. Because the cost of funding is going up despite inflation. Well, not despite inflation, but in part because of inflation.
Do you worry that if the interest rates go up, that it'll also be harder for the small businesses to then also finance, or people who want to start a business to get the investment funds that they want?
It depends. I mean, small businesses, a lot of them don't rely on a ton of debt funding. So it just depends on what is the business and what's the capital structure. So if you're trying to start, for example, a yoga studio somewhere, the best thing you can do is have equity investors backing you. So when you have equity backing you, then you don't really need to worry about what's the price of the bank loan. And you might have a hybrid structure, but if you're getting, for example, an SBA loan, those are fixed rate. So your cost of funding is baked in, even if rates go up over the next 5 years. So I don't think that question is as easily answered. I think the businesses that really suffered are the acquisition type businesses that rely on cheap funding. So private equity firms, REITs, those kind of businesses. I think development suffered. And that's the argument behind why raising interest rates slows down economic activity. So anything that's financed by debt becomes more expensive to finance. So it just, if the cost goes up, then the volume goes down.
Sure. I know America has struggled in honestly the last like 10 years plus with small business creation in the first place. What have been like the overarching barriers to that? I mean, there's some of the things we talked about, but I know that there is a lot of perhaps untapped entrepreneurship in the country. And I was just wondering if, I know you've seen things at a micro level looking at different businesses, but are there like kind of arching trends that show up?
Yeah. So I mean, that's exactly what I'm working on right now in my startup, which is basically a service-based platform that helps small businesses quickly get off the ground. And I just, again, talking to small business owners. So one of the biggest barriers is just the fear and intimidation factor, because there's a lot of people that have a wide variety of talents that are not specific to legal and finance. Whereas those are the things that you have to figure out at the beginning in order to get a business legally off the ground. So what does it mean to have a corporate entity? What's an LLC? What's a C Corp? What's an S Corp? Some people have no idea what these things mean. Other people don't even know that the terms are out there. They've never even heard the terms. And so this knowledge wall is tough to climb for a lot of people. But they might be really good at whatever their core business is. You might have somebody who's a brilliant personal chef and can make a $90K a year small business just providing personal chef services to people. But how do you get started? You know how to cook. You know how to please customers. But what do you actually have to do to get started? how do you get your name out there? What is SEO? How do I get a website up? How do I incorporate? What kind of bank account do I need? What are all these state registrations and permits that I need to do this? Are there any? So that's what we're trying to help people with. And the name of the business it's called launchcraft.biz. So if you can put that in your podcast.
Yeah, I'll add a description.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the big barriers. And my team, we have a thesis that in the way that you said, my view on the economy is that things reset and return to equilibrium. So what we're going to see is a return to equilibrium on small business creation as well. In part because people are going to be like, okay, well, it is inflationary. I do have skills. I want to use my particular skills. And how can I do that? And with the gig economy, in our view, is only the beginning. So there's a lot of people who are driving Ubers that have better skills than driving Uber. So how can we actualize that? How can we get them off the ground? And that's why we want to help them launch their craft.
Makes sense. Definitely a mission I would support, at least in principle. Well, gosh, that's all the questions I had. I want to thank you so much for coming on. Feel like we learned a lot. As I go deeper into my economics journey, I'm sure I can maybe pick your brain about some other things as they come up.
Terrific. And thank you for having me on. Had a lot of fun. And let me know if you've got any other questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yep.